The classroom was a simmering pot of noise, the kind of barely controlled chaos that Mrs. Johnson had long since learned to navigate. The final period of the day was always a struggle. Papers shuffled, low murmurs carried from the back row, and the unmistakable sound of someone trying to stealthily munch on chips filled the air. She stood at the front, arms crossed, waiting for the moment they'd all finally settle. It never ceased to amaze her how each day felt like a new episode in a sitcom she hadn't signed up for. "All right, class, let's try something new today," Mrs. Johnson began, her voice cutting through the din, calm but commanding. "How about you turn in your homework on time for once? I know it's a radical idea, but let's live dangerously." A few students chuckled, while others groaned as if the mere mention of homework was an offense to their teenage souls. "Mrs. Johnson, I couldn't print mine out," one kid whined, his voice dripping with the confidence of someone who thought they had just given the ultimate excuse. "Oh well, if the printer was broken, I guess the deadline magically moves to next week," she replied, mock serious, eyebrow raised. The class chuckled again, but Mrs. Johnson's expression quickly turned deadpan. "Just kidding, that doesn't happen. Homework, on my desk, now." More groans. Some shuffled to the front with crumpled papers in hand. The typical dance of classroom life. But then, right as the day was about to shift back to normal, it happened. Maybe if you spent more time worrying about yourself and less about us, you wouldn't look so old. Brandon. Of course, it was Brandon. He sat there, his legs kicked out in front of him like he was holding court, a smirk playing across his face. He lived for these moments, moments when he could lob a comment and watch the room ripple with tension. It was the kind of thing a kid like Brandon thought would earn him instant respect, or at the very least, a few laughs. For a second, the class went still. Everyone's eyes darted between Mrs. Johnson and Brandon, the air heavy with the unspoken anticipation of what was about to come next. Even the sound of munching chips stopped. Mrs. Johnson, however, didn't flinch. Years of dealing with classroom antics had given her a kind of unshakable calm. She wasn't fazed. Instead, she stood there, perfectly still, giving Brandon just enough silence to feel uncomfortable. She tilted her head slightly and said, "Brandon, if you think your little comment just took years off my life, I hate to break it to you, but you're not that powerful." The class snickered, some kids trying to hide their laughter behind their hands. Brandon's smirk faltered slightly, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Just saying, maybe you could, try a new look. Change things up a bit." Mrs. Johnson gave him a once-over, the kind of look that wasn't angry, but definitely wasn't impressed. "You know, Brandon, I was going to suggest the same thing to you about your grades, but I didn't think it was my place." This time, the laughter wasn't contained. It bubbled up from all corners of the room, and even a couple of Brandon's friends were snickering. He shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, and one more thing," Mrs. Johnson added, walking back to her desk, completely unfazed. "It's funny, isn't it, how people who have the least to offer are usually the loudest? You've got so much to say about looks, but I've yet to hear anything useful from you in class." The silence that followed was palpable. Brandon blinked, mouth open, clearly unsure of how to respond. Mrs. Johnson didn't even give him the satisfaction of looking back at him again. Instead, she turned to the board and picked up her marker, ready to dive back into today's lesson. Now, if we're done with our fashion advice, let's return to something that actually matters. Shakespeare. I'm sure he had more interesting things to say than Brandon does. The class erupted once more, and even Brandon's bravado couldn't withstand the wave of laughter. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, defeated. Mrs. Johnson hadn't just won the moment, she'd owned it. And with that, she carried on, teaching as if the insult had been nothing more than a passing breeze. Because to her, it was. Mrs. Johnson didn't miss a beat as she continued writing on the board, unfazed by Brandon's little outburst. The class was still buzzing from the takedown, but she knew better than to let it linger too long. Silence, she'd found, was the best weapon when it came to classroom antics. Give them too much attention and they'd just try harder next time. Keep it moving and they'd realize there's no winning against a teacher who doesn't flinch. After scribbling a quote from Macbeth, she turned back to the class with a thoughtful expression, as if she hadn't just verbally disarmed Brandon moments ago. "So," she began, tapping the board with her marker, "what do we think Shakespeare was getting at when he wrote, 'Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow'?" The class blinked at her, most of them still mentally replaying the roasting of Brandon and not quite focused on existential quotes. She raised an eyebrow, waiting for someone to take a stab at it. But as expected, the room was quiet. Mrs. Johnson smirked slightly, setting down her marker. Time to bring it home. "You see, what Shakespeare was saying is that life's too short to waste on things that don't matter." She leaned against her desk, crossing her arms. "Like other people's opinions about your looks, for instance." Her eyes slid to Brandon, who was now pretending to be fascinated by the blank space in his notebook. "People are always going to have something to say," she continued, addressing the entire room but never quite breaking eye contact with Brandon. "Sometimes it's about your hair, or your skin, or how you dress. Sometimes it's about things that go deeper, like where you come from or what you stand for. And when that happens, you've got two choices." The class had quieted down now, fully tuned in. Mrs. Johnson had a way of doing that, bringing them in, keeping them curious. She paced slowly in front of the desks, as if sharing something personal but never giving too much away. Choice number one, you let it get to you. You let it shape how you see yourself. And before you know it, you're living your life according to other people's standards. You try to fit in, you shrink yourself down, all to make someone else feel comfortable. She paused, her voice softening slightly. "But there's choice number two." She walked over to Brandon's desk and tapped it lightly with the back of her hand, making him look up at her, startled. "You own who you are, every bit of it. The good, the bad, the rough, if that's what some people think." The class chuckled at the callback to Brandon's comment, and Mrs. Johnson smiled, letting the humor hang for a moment. "But here's the secret," she added, her voice a little lower, more conspiratorial. "When you know yourself, when you really know yourself, no one else's opinion can touch you. Not in any way that matters." Brandon blinked at her, suddenly a little less sure of himself. Mrs. Johnson wasn't mad. She wasn't giving him detention or writing him off like every other teacher had. She was calm, in control, and somehow that was worse than any lecture or punishment he could have gotten. "And Brandon," she said, straightening up and walking back to the front of the room, "I've known myself for a long time, so no offense, but you're going to have to try a lot harder than that if you want to get under my skin." The class erupted in laughter again, but this time, it wasn't just at Brandon's expense. There was admiration mixed in, a newfound respect for Mrs. Johnson's ability to take a punch and throw one right back without breaking a sweat. Brandon, to his credit, leaned back in his chair and gave a sheepish grin. He'd lost this round, and he knew it. But something told him that Mrs. Johnson wasn't the kind of person you wanted to stay on the wrong side of for long. "Now," Mrs. Johnson said, returning to the lesson, "unless anyone else has fashion advice to offer, let's get back to Macbeth. Because believe it or not, teenagers weren't the only ones dealing with people's opinions back in the day." She turned back to the board, but as she did, her thoughts lingered for a moment. Brandon's insult hadn't hurt, not in the way he thought it might, but it did remind her of all the times she'd heard worse, far worse, and it took her back, just for a moment, to the days when comments like that did hurt, when they stuck with her. But those days were long gone. She had grown, evolved, and built a life far more meaningful than any shallow insult could ever touch. She could have dropped some truth bombs about her past right there, could have told the class just how little Brandon knew about who he was dealing with. But that wasn't her style. She knew better than to give everything away at once. Let them stay curious. Let them wonder. After all, there was always more to Mrs. Johnson than met the eye. The bell rang, cutting through the classroom chatter like a knife, and students bolted for the door. Backpacks zipped up, chairs screeched against the floor, and the usual mad rush to freedom began. Mrs. Johnson stayed behind her desk, watching as the tide of teenagers poured into the hallway. She caught a glimpse of Brandon slipping out with his group of friends, his swagger just a little more pronounced than usual. "Yo, Brandon!" one of his buddies called out, slapping him on the back as they pushed their way toward the lockers. "That was savage, man. You really roasted Mrs. J? Brandon grinned, basking in the glow of what he thought was a major victory. Yeah. Did you see the look on her face? She didn't know what hit her. He puffed out his chest a little, feeling like he'd scored some real points in the high school game of who can be the most annoying. The truth was he hadn't been thinking much when he made the comment. It was the usual stuff that he and his crew threw around casually. Jokes about people's looks, snide remarks about their clothes, and, if they were feeling particularly bold, their race. Mrs. Johnson just happened to be today's target, and in Brandon's mind, he'd landed a solid hit. Sure, she'd clap back, but that didn't matter. He figured no teacher could really recover from getting dragged in front of the whole class. You should have seen the way she just stood there. Like I had her, Brandon continued, now in full boast mode. He leaned against the lockers, his smirk plastered on his face like he'd just won a gold medal in being an absolute jerk. Bet she's gonna think twice before stepping up to me again. But not everyone was buying into Brandon's version of events. Across the hall, one of the girls from his class, Zoe, leaned against her locker, shaking her head. Zoe had been in Mrs. Johnson's class for 2 years now, and she'd seen enough to know that Brandon's little victory lap was, well, premature. Zoe, sharp as ever, decided to throw in her 2 cents. Brandon? Hate to break it to you, but you didn't exactly win anything in there. Mrs. J didn't even flinch. You looked like you were the one trying too hard. Brandon shot her a glare. What are you talking about? You saw how everyone was laughing. She didn't know how to handle me. Zoe raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. No, she handled you just fine. You were the one stumbling over your words like a kid who couldn't find his way out of a paper bag. A couple of Brandon's friends snickered at that, and his smile faltered slightly. He glanced around, searching for a quick comeback, but the words seemed to slip through his fingers. Whatever. She's just a teacher, he muttered, shrugging it off, but the confidence in his voice wavered. But Zoe wasn't letting it go. She's not just a teacher, Brandon. She's Mrs. Johnson. You might think you got under her skin, but believe me, she's seen way worse than you. You think some half-baked comment about her hair is going to shake her? Please. Brandon rolled his eyes, trying to brush off Zoe's words, but there was an uncomfortable knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not by someone like Zoe, who wasn't exactly part of his usual crowd. His friends were supposed to be laughing along with him, not questioning if he'd actually done anything impressive. The shift in energy was unsettling. Another kid, Jamal, who was standing nearby, chimed in. He was one of Mrs. Johnson's favorites, though she never played favorites outright. It was just obvious that she appreciated students who didn't spend their time trying to act like they ran the school. Jamal shook his head at Brandon, his face a mix of disbelief and pity. Man, I don't get it. Why would you even go after Mrs. J like that? I mean, you think because she's black and she's a woman, that somehow makes her an easy target? Jamal asked, his tone serious but not confrontational. There was something in his eyes, a challenge, that made Brandon shift uncomfortably again. It was just a joke, Brandon muttered defensively, shoving his hands into his pockets. A joke? Jamal echoed. Look, dude, we all know what it was. You made a comment about her hair, thinking you were funny, but it's not a joke. You've got no idea who she is or what she's been through. You probably don't even care. But here's the thing, you should. Brandon scowled, not liking the direction this conversation was taking. He hated feeling like the spotlight was suddenly on him for all the wrong reasons. He glanced around for some support from his friends, but most of them had gone quiet, awkwardly avoiding his gaze. Even the ones who usually had his back seemed to be reconsidering their stance. Whatever, man, Brandon mumbled, trying to sound like he didn't care, but his voice lacked the usual bravado. It's not that deep. Jamal leaned in slightly, his voice low but clear. It is that deep. Maybe not to you, but to people like Mrs. Johnson. That kind of stuff sticks. It's not just words, Brandon. It's the same racist crap people have been throwing at black women for years. But I guess you wouldn't know anything about that. There it was, out in the open. Brandon felt his cheeks flush, but not from anger this time. There was something else creeping in, something unfamiliar. Shame. Maybe it was the way Jamal said it, not with anger, but with this quiet confidence that made it hard to brush off. Or maybe it was the look Zoe was giving him, like she expected him to at least try and understand what he'd done. But Brandon wasn't ready to give up just yet. "I didn't say anything racist," he blurted out, his voice a little louder than he intended. "I just made a comment about her hair. People joke about stuff like that all the time." Zoe let out a low sigh, shaking her head again. "Brandon, it's not just a comment. You think you're being funny, but what you said wasn't original. It's the same tired insult black women have been hearing forever. You might not get it, but it's there. And Mrs. J, she's got way more class than to waste her time explaining that to you." Brandon's bravado was officially in tatters. He opened his mouth to fire back, but no words came out. His mind raced as he tried to find a way to recover, but all he could think about was the way Mrs. Johnson had looked at him. Calm, composed, like she saw right through him. And maybe she had. The bell rang again, signaling the next class, and the hallway surged with movement. Brandon felt the tension ease as people began to disperse, heading to their next period. He stood there for a moment, his hands still jammed in his pockets, watching as Jamal and Zoe walked away, talking quietly amongst themselves. Brandon's friends patted him on the back, muttering things like, "Don't worry about it, bro," and "They're just haters." But the words rang hollow. For the first time in a long time, Brandon didn't feel like the victor in his own story. As he walked toward his next class, Brandon found his mind drifting back to Mrs. Johnson. The way she hadn't even flinched, the way she'd turned his insult into a lesson, and the way Jamal had said it wasn't just about words, that it went deeper than that. Brandon wasn't used to feeling out of his depth, but right now, he was sinking. Mrs. Johnson wiped the board clean, watching the last of the students file out. The squeak of the dry erase marker was the only sound that filled the classroom now, but her mind was somewhere else, replaying the scene with Brandon from earlier. It was funny how these moments, these seemingly small, insignificant moments, could stir memories she hadn't touched in years. Her hands moved mechanically, erasing the remnants of Macbeth's soliloquy, but her thoughts drifted further back to her own high school days. It wasn't so different from Brandon's world, except back then, the insults weren't wrapped in humor. They were sharp, direct, and meant to cut deep. Growing up as one of the only black girls in a predominantly white school wasn't exactly a nurturing environment, but she had learned to deal with the remarks. You had to, if you wanted to survive. There were plenty of moments where her patience was tested, where comments about her hair, her skin, or her attitude were thrown at her, just like Brandon had done today. But back then, she wasn't Mrs. Johnson. She was just Elaine, quiet, unsure, and still learning how to hold her head up high in a world that didn't always see her worth. She chuckled softly to herself, imagining the look on Brandon's face if he knew half the things she'd been through. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very thing he tried to use against her was the thing she'd spent years perfecting. The strength to stand tall, to walk into a room and own it, no matter what anyone had to say. She glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of the soccer field where the varsity team was practicing. The past still had its grip on her, but it wasn't a weight anymore. It was more like a scar, faded but still there, a reminder of what she'd overcome. "Ms. J," a voice called from the doorway, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Mr. Edwards, the history teacher who shared her free period. He strolled in, hands shoved in his pockets, a friendly smile on his face. He and Mrs. Johnson had been working at the school together for years, and their shared lunches were filled with the kind of banter only teachers understood. "Another day? Another drama?" he asked, raising an eyebrow as he leaned against her desk. Mrs. Johnson sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You could say that. Brandon tried to play comedian today." Mr. Edwards let out a low whistle. "Oof, I saw the fallout in the hallway. Kid's got nerve, I'll give him that." "What did he say this time?" "Oh, you know," Mrs. Johnson said with a wave of her hand. "The usual. Something about my hair, and how I should be spending more time on my looks." Mr. Edwards laughed. The audacity of a 15-year-old to think he knows anything about hair, let alone your hair. Right? But it's always the same story. They think they're saying something new, like it's the first time I've ever heard an insult like that. She smirked. "Little do they know." Mr. Edwards chuckled, shaking his head. Man, if they only knew what you've been through, half the kids here wouldn't last a day in your shoes." She paused, staring out the window again, lost in thought for a moment before responding. "Yeah, well, they'll never know, and they don't need to." There was a long silence between them. Mr. Edwards knew better than to press. Mrs. Johnson wasn't one to dwell on her past, and when she did share, it was only ever in small doses. But the kids, they had no idea just how much history stood in front of them every day in that classroom. "That's the thing about teaching, huh?" Mrs. Johnson mused, breaking the silence. "They see you in front of them every day, but they don't really see you. They don't know what you've gone through to get here." She glanced at Mr. Edwards, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "And they definitely don't know I was once in their shoes, just like them. A smart-mouthed kid with no clue about life." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You? A smart mouth?" "Oh, please," she said, laughing. "I was just as bad as Brandon. Worse even. The difference is, back then, I didn't have anyone to call me out. Not like the way I do with these kids." Mrs. Johnson leaned back in her chair, letting her thoughts wander again, to the time she'd tried to prove herself in high school, just like Brandon had tried today. The insults had come flying, quick and cruel, but she'd learned. She had to. She remembered one day in particular when she was no older than 16, and a girl named Jessica, blonde, blue-eyed, and ready to make trouble, had made some snide remark about her hair during gym class. Something about how it was wild and unprofessional. Elaine had wanted to fight back, but all she could do was grit her teeth, hold her head up, and walk away. No one had been there to stand up for her. She had learned how to fight that battle on her own. "Anyway," she continued, snapping back to the present, "Brandon got a lesson in humility today, whether he realizes it or not." Mr. Edwards smirked. "I'll bet he did. You have a way of teaching those kinds of lessons." They shared a laugh, and for a moment the heavy memories that had been swirling in Mrs. Johnson's mind lightened. It felt good to laugh about it now, to see how far she'd come. But the truth was, the road to where she stood today hadn't been easy. There had been a time when the weight of being a black woman in predominantly white spaces felt unbearable. College had been another battlefield, one where she had to prove herself twice as much for half the recognition. Every success was questioned, every accomplishment downplayed. And through it all, there had been comments, small, biting, almost insignificant in the moment. But together they piled up like bricks, building a wall she had to break through. Now, she remembered the first time she stood in front of a classroom, nervous, unsure of herself, and knowing that many of the students sitting in those desks were just waiting to test her. The stares, the whispers, the silent judgment that came with being a black woman in charge. But slowly, year by year, she learned how to turn those moments into strength. "You ever tell them about your past?" Mr. Edwards asked, breaking her thoughts again. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "No. I mean, bits and pieces come out when it's relevant, but I don't need them knowing everything. It's not about me. It's about them." Mr. Edwards nodded, but there was a knowing look in his eyes. "Maybe, but sometimes it helps for them to know who's standing in front of them. Could change the way they see things, the way they see you." Mrs. Johnson smiled softly. "Maybe, but I like to keep a little mystery. Let them wonder." Mr. Edwards chuckled, pushing off from the desk. "Well, keep working your magic, Ms. J. You've got a whole classroom of kids who have no idea how lucky they are." As Mr. Edwards left the room, Mrs. Johnson sat back, her thoughts still trailing through memories of her past. There was something powerful about letting them stay curious, about not giving away all her history. It was a story she had earned, but not one she needed to tell. At least not yet. Because after all, Mrs. Johnson wasn't just a teacher with a tough exterior. She was a survivor, a trailblazer, someone who had walked through fire and come out stronger on the other side. And for now, that was a story she would keep close, until the time was right. And perhaps, just maybe, one day, when the lesson needed it most, she'd let them in on the secret. The parent-teacher conference was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and Mrs. Johnson could already tell this one would be different. The usual pre-conference nervousness wasn't there. This was more like anticipation. She had dealt with parents like Brandon's before. The kind that walked in with a certain swagger, assuming they could charm, intimidate, or outmaneuver their way through anything. But Mrs. Johnson wasn't a first-year teacher anymore, and certainly not one to be fazed by people who thought they could size her up just by the color of her skin. As the clock struck 3, Brandon's parents strolled into the room. His father, Mr. Daniels, was tall, with a pressed suit and a posture that screamed, "I'm important." His mother, Mrs. Daniels, followed closely behind, wearing a too-tight smile and heels that echoed through the empty halls. The air of superiority was almost palpable. Mrs. Johnson welcomed them with a smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Mr. Daniels gave her a quick once-over before sitting down, as if sizing her up, trying to determine whether she was someone he could easily sway. His wife followed, her eyes darting around the classroom as if she'd never stepped foot in a public school before. "We're here to discuss Brandon," Mr. Daniels began, leaning back in his chair like he was settling in for a negotiation. "I understand there's been an incident." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her expression calm and collected. "Yes, there was a comment made in class. I thought it was best that we discuss it together." Mrs. Daniels pursed her lips, the tight smile still plastered on her face. "Well, you know how teenagers can be. They say things without thinking. Boys will be boys, right?" Mrs. Johnson kept her expression neutral, though the phrase made her stomach turn. "Yes, teenagers do have a way of speaking without thinking," she said evenly. "But this situation goes beyond typical teenage banter." Mr. Daniels shifted in his seat, crossing his legs and folding his hands on his knee. "Look, Mrs. Johnson, I'm sure Brandon didn't mean any harm. He's a good boy. We've raised him to be respectful, and if he said something out of line, it was probably just a joke that didn't land. He's a kid, after all." Mrs. Johnson leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Mr. Daniels. "I understand that, Mr. Daniels, but there are certain comments about race, appearance, that carry a weight you might not realize. What Brandon said wasn't just a joke, it was an insult, and one that taps into deeper issues that young people, like your son, need to be aware of." Mrs. Daniels blinked, her smile faltering. "Well, we're not here to debate political correctness, Mrs. Johnson. We're here to make sure Brandon isn't being unfairly targeted. He's not a bad kid, and we wouldn't want a small misunderstanding to affect his record." There it was, the subtle implication that this whole thing could just disappear with the right amount of pressure. Mrs. Johnson almost smiled. Almost. She'd seen this before. Parents who thought their kids' behavior could be swept under the rug, if only they found the right way to smooth it over. They assumed she was just another teacher they could push around. But today, they were in for a surprise. Mrs. Johnson leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "I'm not here to target Brandon," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to teach him, and that includes teaching him about the impact of his words. This isn't just about his record. It's about his understanding of the world around him." There was a brief, awkward silence as Mr. and Mrs. Daniels exchanged glances. They hadn't expected this. Mrs. Johnson could see the wheels turning in Mr. Daniels' mind, trying to figure out how to respond. "Well, I'm sure you're doing your best," Mr. Daniels said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "But let's be honest. Brandon's comment, while inappropriate, hardly warrants this level of concern. After all, we're talking about a high school classroom here. Not everything needs to be turned into a lesson on race and society. Don't you think?" Mrs. Johnson's gaze didn't waver. "With all due respect, Mr. Daniels, that's exactly where these lessons need to be taught. If we don't address these issues in the classroom, where do you expect them to be addressed?" Mrs. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her smile now fully gone. "We just feel that perhaps this has been blown out of proportion. We don't want Brandon's future to be affected by, well, a misunderstanding." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her expression calm, though her patience was thinning. "I understand your concern for Brandon's future, but I'm more concerned about what kind of future he'll have if he doesn't learn the importance of respecting people, regardless of their race or appearance." Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Mrs. Johnson's smile was small, but it held a wealth of experience behind it. What I mean is that Brandon, like many young people, is growing up in a world that's more connected and diverse than ever before. His understanding, or lack of understanding, about race and respect will impact his relationships, his career, his entire future. It's my job to help him realize that now, before he leaves this classroom. There was another pause, longer this time. Mr. Daniels's confident facade was cracking, and Mrs. Daniels seemed at a loss for what to say next. The arrogance they'd walked in with was slowly evaporating. It was time to seal the deal. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward again, her tone gentle but firm. "I've been teaching for a long time, Mr. Daniels. I've seen students from all walks of life, and I've watched them grow into adults. Some of them go on to do great things because they learn these lessons early. Lessons about empathy, understanding, and respect. Others, well, they struggle because no one ever took the time to teach them. I'd rather Brandon be part of the first group." Mr. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Johnson wasn't finished. She smiled, leaning back and crossing her arms again. "And just so you know, I didn't get to where I am by letting students or parents walk all over me. I've earned my place here. I'm not just a teacher who's here to clock in and out. I'm someone who's worked in law before I came into education, someone who's been part of communities that fought for their rights. So believe me when I say, I know the value of words, and I know the cost of not teaching our young people the right way to use them." Mr. Daniels's expression had shifted from one of smug confidence to something closer to shock. He hadn't expected that. Mrs. Daniels's face had paled slightly, and she cleared her throat, sitting up straighter in her chair. "Well, we appreciate your perspective, Mrs. Johnson," she said, her tone noticeably more respectful. "I think we can agree that this is a learning experience for all of us." Mrs. Johnson nodded, offering a polite smile. "Exactly. It's all about learning. And if there's anything else you'd like to discuss, I'm more than happy to have another meeting. But for now, I think we understand each other." Mr. Daniels stood up, his face carefully neutral, and reached out to shake her hand. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Johnson. We'll speak with Brandon." Mrs. Johnson took his hand, her grip firm but polite. "I appreciate that." As they left the room, the confidence they'd walked in with, replaced by a quiet humility, Mrs. Johnson sat back in her chair, letting out a small sigh. It wasn't that she enjoyed moments like this, but there was a certain satisfaction in showing people that she was more than they ever expected, more than they assumed. She glanced at the clock. Another day, another lesson. Brandon sat in the back of the library, his phone screen glowing in front of him as he tapped aimlessly on it. He hadn't planned on coming here. In fact, he had zero interest in school libraries in general. Too quiet, too many people pretending to be smarter than they were. But here he was feeling, well, weird. Mrs. Johnson had gotten under his skin, and he didn't like it. She was just supposed to be another teacher. Strict, a little sarcastic, and probably bored with her job like the rest of them. But ever since the incident in class, and then hearing Zoe and Jamal talk in the hallway, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than he thought. That parent-teacher meeting hadn't helped either. His dad had come home quieter than usual, which was definitely not normal for Mr. Daniels, who could talk his way out of a speeding ticket. His mom? Well, she just said Mrs. Johnson was someone not to be messed with. But neither of them had really explained what had gone down during the meeting. They just told Brandon to shape up, as if he could suddenly become a different person overnight. Brandon leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Something about Mrs. Johnson gnawed at him. Who was she really? Why did everyone at school talk about her like she was some kind of superhero in disguise? Even his dad, who usually had an answer for everything, had been vague. And Brandon hated being in the dark. "Guess I'll have to find out myself," he muttered, opening up his laptop. He typed in her name. Elaine Johnson. Common enough name. A bunch of random profiles popped up. Some LinkedIn accounts, a few Twitter profiles. But nothing that screamed, "I'm your teacher." He scrolled for a bit, ready to give up when something caught his eye. It was an old article, buried in a local newspaper archive. The headline made him blink. "Civil rights attorney Elaine Johnson, fighting for justice, one case at a time." Brandon sat up straighter, his heart picking up speed. Civil rights attorney? No way that was the same Mrs. Johnson. He clicked on the article, skimming through the paragraphs. Elaine Johnson, a Harvard Law graduate, has spent the last decade as a fierce advocate for racial equality and social justice. Known for her groundbreaking work on civil rights cases, particularly in the areas of housing discrimination and police reform, Johnson has earned national recognition for her tireless efforts to combat systemic racism. Brandon's mouth went dry. He read the words again, slower this time, trying to process them. Harvard, national recognition, police reform. This couldn't be right. Mrs. Johnson was just his teacher, the one who made lame jokes about Shakespeare and handed out homework like it was candy. There was no way she was that Mrs. Johnson. He scrolled further down the article, his fingers trembling slightly. There was a picture, faded and grainy, but it was her. Younger, yes, but undeniably Mrs. Johnson. She was standing at a podium, giving a speech in front of a crowd, her expression as fierce and determined as it had been in class. Brandon's mind raced. How had he not known this? How had anyone not known this? He kept reading, unable to stop now that he was hooked. There were mentions of court cases she'd won, protests she'd led, and organizations she'd worked with. She had been everywhere. Marches, rallies, even on TV. The article said she had been a prominent voice in some of the most high-profile civil rights cases of the last decade. Brandon leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. There's no way this is real. He scrolled through the comments section of the article, finding people talking about how she had impacted their lives, how she had changed the way they viewed justice and equality. Some commenters referred to her as a modern-day Rosa Parks, or a legal trailblazer. Brandon clicked on a related link, this one taking him to a more recent profile of her career. It was an interview she had done a few years back, just before she'd left law to become a teacher. She'd said something about wanting to make a difference in a more personal way, to teach the next generation about history and justice. There was even a quote from her. "If we don't teach our kids to fight for what's right, then the fight is lost before it's even begun." Brandon felt a lump form in his throat. He clicked back to the photo, staring at the image of Mrs. Johnson standing at the podium. How could someone like her be standing in front of his class every day, dealing with smart-mouthed kids like him, and never once mention any of this? She wasn't just a teacher. She was something else, someone important. And he had insulted her over something as stupid as her hair. Brandon closed his laptop and sat there in silence, feeling a heavy weight settle over him. His mind kept replaying his comment from class, the way Mrs. Johnson had handled it so effortlessly, like she had heard it 1,000 times before. And maybe she had, because if she had been fighting in courtrooms and leading protests, dealing with kids like him must have been child's play. For the first time, Brandon felt something he wasn't used to. Shame. Real, deep shame. It wasn't just that he'd been rude or disrespectful. He had been ignorant, completely ignorant of who she was, what she stood for, and what she had already achieved. He'd thrown out a lazy insult, thinking it was funny, without realizing he was taking aim at someone who had been through more battles than he could even imagine. He thought back to what Jamal had said in the hallway. "You don't know anything about her." And he'd been right. Brandon didn't know. He had judged her, assumed he knew her, and now he just felt like an idiot. His mind raced with questions. Why hadn't she told them? Why was she just a teacher now, after everything she'd done? And why had she never said anything, never once mentioned any of this to the class? Brandon knew one thing for sure. The next time he saw Mrs. Johnson, he wouldn't be looking at her the same way. There was so much more to her than he'd ever given her credit for. And now that he knew, well, he wasn't sure how to act around her. All he knew was that he had a lot to think about. He packed up his things and left the library, walking slowly down the hall, his head spinning, the faces around him blurred as he thought about everything he'd just learned. Mrs. Johnson had lived a life more remarkable than anything he could have imagined, and he had dismissed her as just another teacher, someone he could make fun of for a cheap laugh. As he headed out of the building and into the crisp afternoon air, one thought lingered in his mind, heavy and undeniable. I was wrong. Brandon hadn't slept much the night before. It wasn't that he hadn't tried. He'd tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, his mind running in circles around everything he'd learned about Mrs. Johnson. The article, the photos, her entire past. It was like finding out your math teacher used to be a secret agent or something. How could she just stand there every day and teach kids Shakespeare like she hadn't been out in the world, fighting for people's rights, making real change? It didn't make sense. And now here he was sitting in class, staring at the back of her head as she wrote on the board, his stomach in knots. He was never nervous, never. But today, he felt like he'd eaten a bowl of rocks for breakfast. Mrs. Johnson was her usual composed self, gliding through the lesson, asking questions about whatever Shakespeare and tragedy they were covering this week. Usually Brandon wouldn't care. He'd have his feet up on the desk, throwing in the occasional sarcastic comment to keep himself entertained. But today, he was quiet. Mrs. Johnson didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and she was just waiting for him to make the first move. Either way, he had to say something. He had to know why she had never mentioned any of this. Why she had let everyone treat her like any other teacher when she was so much more. As the class came to an end and students packed up their things, Brandon stayed behind, his heart pounding like he was about to take the SATs without studying. He waited until the room was empty before approaching her desk. "Mrs. Johnson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Brandon? Something on your mind?" He swallowed hard. Yeah. Actually, there is." She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, a small smile playing on her lips. "I figured. You've been unusually quiet today. What's going on? Did Shakespeare finally get to you? It happens to the best of us." Brandon chuckled awkwardly, running a hand through his hair. "No, it's not that. It's just, I found something out about you." Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what would that be?" He hesitated, feeling the weight of his own curiosity pressing down on him. I read about you. Online. Like articles and stuff. About your past." For the first time, Mrs. Johnson's expression changed slightly. It wasn't surprise exactly, but more of a knowing look, as if she had been expecting this moment at some point. "I see," she said slowly, nodding. "So, you've been doing your homework after all. I knew I'd get to you eventually." Brandon laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, I guess so. But why didn't you ever say anything? I mean, you're not just a teacher. You're like a superhero or something. Civil rights cases, Harvard law, all of that. Why didn't you tell us?" Mrs. Johnson sighed, leaning forward on her desk and folding her hands. "Brandon, let me ask you something. If I had told you all of that on day one, do you think you would have listened to me any differently?" He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, realizing he didn't actually know the answer. "I don't know," he admitted. She smiled, but it wasn't the usual teasing smile she used when she was trying to get a point across with humor. This one was softer, more thoughtful. "Exactly. You don't know because it's not about where I've been or what I've done. It's about what I'm doing. Right now." Brandon furrowed his brow, still confused. "But all that stuff you did, it's important. It's huge. You should be, like, famous or something. Not just here." Mrs. Johnson let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You know, I get that a lot. People think that because you've done something big, that's the only thing that defines you. But let me tell you something, Brandon. Those cases, the work I did as a lawyer, that's only part of who I am. And it's not the most important part, at least not to me." Brandon frowned. "What do you mean? How can that not be the most important part? You were literally changing the world." Mrs. Johnson leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Changing the world, that's quite a statement. But here's the thing. Changing the world doesn't always mean standing on the steps of the Supreme Court or leading a march. Sometimes, changing the world means standing in front of a classroom full of kids like you and helping you understand that your words have power." She paused, letting that sink in. Brandon shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of her words. He hadn't thought about it like that before. "Look," Mrs. Johnson continued, "I could have stayed in law. I could have kept fighting those battles, but I wanted to do something more personal, something that would have a ripple effect. Because Brandon, it's not just about the big moments. It's about the little ones too. The moments where you realize that how you treat people, how you talk to them, how you see them, that's what really matters. Brandon was silent, absorbing everything she was saying. He'd never thought of his words that way before. They'd always just been words, throwaway jokes, comments to get a laugh or fill the silence. But now, hearing her talk about it, he realized how shallow that thinking was. "But why not tell people?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. "Why not let everyone know who you are? It's like people would respect you more if they knew." Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow, her teasing smile returning. "Oh, so I'm not respected now?" Brandon stammered. No, that's not what I meant. I don't know." She laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that made the tension in the room dissipate. "I'm just messing with you, Brandon. But seriously, think about it. Do you respect me now because of what I've done, or because of how I handled that little situation in class?" He blinked, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't thought about it that way. "I guess both?" She smiled. "Exactly. And that's the point. If I walk in here and start listing off my accomplishments, sure, some people might be impressed. But would they really listen to what I'm saying? Or would they just put me on a pedestal and assume that because I've done some cool things, I don't understand what it's like to be them?" Brandon nodded slowly. He could see her point. "So, it's not about where you come from. It's about how you treat people." Mrs. Johnson's eyes lit up, and she pointed at him like he'd just won a prize. "Bingo! Now you're getting it!" She leaned forward again, her tone softening. "Brandon, it's easy to judge people based on what you think you know about them. Their looks, their background, whatever. But the real challenge, the thing that makes you a better person, is learning to see past that, to see people for who they really are, not just what they've done or where they've been. That's what I try to teach every day. That's why I'm here." Brandon felt something shift inside him, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. He wasn't sure if he'd ever really thought about people that way before. He'd always been so quick to make assumptions, to crack jokes, to push people's buttons. But now he was seeing things differently. "So, you're saying it's not about what you've accomplished. It's about, I don't know, how you handle stuff in the moment." Mrs. Johnson grinned. "Exactly. Life isn't just one big victory after another. It's made up of all these little moments where you decide who you are. And trust me, you're going to have plenty of those moments." Brandon sat back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Wow, I guess I never really thought about it like that." She chuckled. "Most people don't. But hey, that's what I'm here for, to make you think." He smiled, feeling lighter than he had all day. "Thanks, Mrs. Johnson." She waved a hand dismissively. "Don't thank me yet. I've still got a pop quiz planned for next week, and trust me, it's going to be brutal." Brandon groaned, rolling his eyes. "Great. And here I thought we were bonding." Mrs. Johnson laughed again. "Oh, we are. But bonding doesn't get you out of Shakespeare, kid." As Brandon gathered his things and headed toward the door, he couldn't help but feel like something had shifted between them. Mrs. Johnson wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was, well, still a teacher. But more than that, she was someone who had been through things he couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, here she was, every day in this classroom, making a difference in ways that went far beyond any court case. As he left the room, he glanced back at her, sitting at her desk, a small smile on her face. For the first time, he saw her not just as a teacher, but as someone who had chosen to be here. Someone who believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. And that was more powerful than anything he could have imagined. The next few days were awkward. Brandon had never thought about how hard it would be to start acting like a decent human being, but here he was, tripping over his own feet at every turn. It wasn't that he wanted to keep being the guy who cracked jokes at people's expense. He just didn't know how to be anything else. Like, where do you even start? On Monday morning, he walked into class determined to be different. He'd made up his mind. No more sarcasm, no more jabs, and, most importantly, no more stupid comments about Mrs. Johnson's appearance. He'd done his research, had that talk with her, and now it was time to, what? Be better? Yeah, that. But being better turned out to be harder than it looked. For starters, when he sat down in his usual spot, he realized that half the time, he didn't actually know how to have a conversation without throwing in a joke. Case in point, Zoe walked in, her headphones around her neck, her hair tied up in a messy bun, and Brandon's first instinct was to say something snarky about her looking like she just woke up. He opened his mouth to do exactly that, but then caught himself just in time. Instead, he blurted out, "Hey, Zoe, cool headphones." She blinked at him like he just suggested they do a group project over the weekend. Thanks, she said, her tone laced with confusion as she slid into her seat. Brandon wanted to kick himself. Cool headphones? Really? Was that the best he could do? But hey, it was progress, right? No insults, no sarcastic digs. It was baby steps, but at least they were in the right direction. The real test came when Mrs. Johnson walked in. Brandon kept his head down, determined to blend into the background and not make any waves. But of course, the universe wasn't about to let him off that easy. "Brandon," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice calm but with that usual spark of humor, "you're unusually quiet today. Should I be worried?" The class turned to look at him, and Brandon felt his face flush. This was it, the moment where old Brandon would have shot back with a snarky one-liner. But new Brandon was trying to be, well, better. He cleared his throat. No, I'm good. Just listening, you know." Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Listening, huh? That's new. Should I call the school paper and report the change?" A few students snickered, but it wasn't mean-spirited. Even Brandon found himself chuckling awkwardly. "Nah, no need for that. Just trying something different." Mrs. Johnson smiled, nodding as she turned back to the board. "Well, whatever it is, keep it up. It suits you." That little exchange might not have seemed like much, but to Brandon, it felt like a huge win. He hadn't cracked a joke or made a fool of himself. He just existed, and for once, that was enough. The days that followed were filled with small, awkward steps forward. He apologized to Mrs. Johnson after class, stumbling through his words like a kid who had never said sorry before, which, to be fair, wasn't too far from the truth. "Mrs. Johnson," he'd started, rubbing the back of his neck nervously, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for, the stuff I said about your hair. It was stupid, and I didn't mean it. Yeah." Mrs. Johnson had listened, her face thoughtful but kind. When he finished, she smiled warmly and said, "Brandon, I appreciate that. It takes guts to admit when you're wrong. But more than that, it takes growth to change. And I've seen you growing. Keep it up." Her words had left Brandon feeling lighter than he had in days. It wasn't just that she'd accepted his apology. It was the fact that she actually believed in him. That she saw him, not as the class clown or the guy who made dumb comments, but as someone who could be better. At home, things were different too. His parents had noticed the change, though they didn't know what to make of it. His dad, usually the one tossing out jokes at the dinner table, seemed confused when Brandon didn't jump in to roast his sister's cooking attempts. "Everything okay, son?" his dad asked one night, eyeing him curiously. "You're awfully quiet these days." Brandon shrugged, poking at his mashed potatoes. "Yeah, just thinking." His mom raised an eyebrow. "Thinking? You? Should we be concerned?" Brandon laughed, feeling some of the tension melt away. "Nah, it's just, I don't know, I'm trying to figure some stuff out." His dad nodded slowly, exchanging a glance with his mom. "Well, whatever it is, don't lose your sense of humor, kid. The world needs people who can laugh." "Yeah, but maybe not all the time," Brandon replied, surprising even himself. His parents looked at him for a moment, then shrugged, as if deciding not to push it further. At school, his shift in attitude didn't go unnoticed. Some of his friends teased him about going soft, but Brandon didn't care. He found himself listening more, paying attention to the way people talked and treated each other. It was strange, like a filter had been lifted, and he was seeing the world in a different light. He started asking more questions in class. Real questions, not just the ones designed to get a laugh. And even though his friends gave him a hard time, he could tell they respected the change, maybe even appreciated it. But the biggest difference was how he treated the people around him, especially those he hadn't thought much about before. He noticed the way kids like Zoe and Jamal carried themselves, the way they dealt with the subtle, everyday comments that flew over most people's heads, but hit them like little jabs. He saw it now in a way he hadn't before. One day after class, he caught up with Jamal in the hallway. "Hey man," Brandon said, awkwardly trying to find the right words. I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about what you said. You know, about Mrs. Johnson and other stuff." Jamal raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Oh yeah." "Yeah," Brandon nodded. "I didn't get it before, but I'm starting to now. The stuff I said, it was messed up. So, thanks for calling me out." Jamal studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "No problem, man. Just glad you're starting to see the bigger picture." Brandon smiled, relieved that the conversation hadn't been a complete disaster. It was still weird for him, navigating this whole trying to be a better person thing, but every small step felt like a victory. And the more he listened, the more he learned. He learned that people's experiences, especially those different from his own, were worth paying attention to. He learned that respect wasn't just about saying the right things, but about truly understanding where others were coming from. And most importantly, he learned that growth wasn't about getting it right all the time. It was about trying, failing, and trying again. He wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but he was trying, and that was more than he could have said a few weeks ago. Brandon knew he still had a long way to go. There would be more awkward moments, more missteps, and probably more times when he said the wrong thing. But now, at least, he was paying attention. And that was a start. The classroom was buzzing as usual, with students chatting, tossing paper balls, and doing everything but paying attention. It was another typical Wednesday, except today was different. Mrs. Johnson had promised to share something with the class. A story. Not just any story, but her story. And as soon as she walked in, the air seemed to shift. Even Brandon, who had been trying his hardest to keep his head down and learn from his mistakes, could feel it. He sat up a little straighter, his attention fully locked on Mrs. Johnson as she strolled to the front of the room, her usual calm, confident smile in place. "All right, everyone," she began, her voice cutting through the noise like a warm breeze. "Settle down. I know I promised you all a story, so let's get started. But first, I want you to know something. This isn't just a story about me. It's a story about all of us, about the things we face, the choices we make, and how those things shape who we become." The room fell silent, every pair of eyes focused on her. Even the students who normally sat in the back, barely paying attention, were listening. Mrs. Johnson leaned against her desk, crossing her arms, her eyes sweeping over the class. "You know, when I was your age, I wasn't much different from you all. A little stubborn, a little too quick to speak my mind. Sound familiar, Brandon?" The class chuckled, and Brandon felt his face heat up, but he smiled anyway. She had a way of doing that, throwing in humor to make everything feel more real. "But seriously," she continued, "I didn't always have it easy. Growing up, I faced a lot of, well, let's call them challenges. I'm sure some of you know what I mean. It wasn't just about being a young black girl in a world that didn't always see me for who I was. It was about proving, over and over again, that I belonged, that I was worth listening to. And let me tell you, that's exhausting." She paused, glancing around the room, letting the weight of her words sink in. "When I was in high school, I dealt with racism in ways that some of you might recognize. There were the comments, small at first, subtle. Why does your hair look like that? You don't act like the other black kids. You're so articulate. People thought they were giving me compliments, but what they were really doing was telling me I didn't fit. And as a teenager, all you want to do is fit, right?" Brandon nodded slowly, feeling a pang of guilt as he remembered the dumb things he'd said to her not so long ago. "But here's the thing," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice softening. You get tired of trying to fit into boxes other people make for you. At some point, you just have to break out of them. And that's exactly what I did. I stopped trying to make myself small so that other people could feel big. I embraced who I was, flaws and all, and I decided to do something with that. She smiled, the kind of smile that came from a place of pride. I went to law school, and not just any law school. Harvard Law. The room buzzed with surprise, a few students whispering, but most just stared in awe. "Yep, that's right," she continued with a grin. "Your teacher is a Harvard grad. And trust me, that wasn't easy. I was often the only black woman in my classes, and I had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. But I didn't back down. I fought my way through, and eventually, I became a civil rights attorney." There it was, the truth that Brandon had read about, now laid bare for the entire class. He watched the reactions of his classmates, wide eyes, jaws slightly dropped, whispers of, "Whoa, I didn't know that," floating around. "I spent years fighting for people who didn't have a voice," Mrs. Johnson continued, her tone growing more serious. "I worked on cases that challenged racism, discrimination, and injustice. I stood in courtrooms and argued for the rights of people who, like me, were told they didn't belong. And for a long time, I thought that was my purpose, to fight those battles, to win those cases." She paused, her gaze shifting, becoming more introspective. "But after a while, I realized something. Winning cases is important, yes, but changing minds, that's where the real work is. And I thought, what better place to do that than in a classroom with the next generation of leaders, thinkers, and doers." Brandon couldn't believe it. She had chosen to leave behind a prestigious career, one where she was making an undeniable impact, to become a teacher, to stand in front of kids like him, kids who sometimes didn't appreciate who she really was or what she had been through. "So here I am," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice lightening again, "standing in front of you because I believe that each one of you has the potential to change the world. Not necessarily by becoming lawyers or activists, but by learning how to treat people with kindness, respect, and empathy. And that's harder than any court case I've ever won." The class was silent, every word hanging in the air like a weight pressing down on them. Brandon, for the first time, felt a lump in his throat. He had always seen Mrs. Johnson as just another teacher, someone whose job was to give homework and grade tests. But now he saw her as someone who had lived a life filled with challenges and triumphs, someone who had fought battles he couldn't even begin to understand. Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, her smile returning. "I don't share this story to make you feel sorry for me or to impress you. I share it because I want you to understand something. You never know what someone has been through. You never know their full story. So before you judge, before you assume you know everything there is to know about a person, take a step back, listen, learn." She glanced at Brandon and their eyes met. It wasn't an accusatory look, but one filled with understanding. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the message she had been trying to teach him all along. "And remember," she said, her tone lightening once more, "I may be a Harvard-educated, civil rights-fighting, courtroom-crushing attorney, but I'm still going to give you a pop quiz on Shakespeare tomorrow, because I'm also that teacher." The class erupted in laughter, breaking the tension that had filled the room. Mrs. Johnson's ability to balance humor with seriousness was something they'd all come to appreciate, even if they didn't realize it until now. As the laughter faded, Mrs. Johnson looked around the room one last time. "So that's my story, and now it's your turn to write yours. Don't worry if it's messy or complicated. The best stories usually are." Brandon sat back in his chair, feeling something new stir inside him. Respect. Not the forced kind you give just because someone is in charge, but the real kind. The kind that comes from seeing someone for who they truly are. As the bell rang and students began gathering their things, Brandon lingered behind, feeling the need to say something. "Mrs. Johnson?" he called as the last of the students filed out. She looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Brandon?" He hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Thanks for telling us your story. I think I needed to hear it." Mrs. Johnson smiled, a warm, knowing smile. "You're welcome, Brandon, and thank you for listening." With that, he walked out of the room, his mind racing. He had learned more in that one class than he ever had in any textbook. And for the first time, he realized that real education wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about people, their stories, their experiences, their struggles. And he was ready to start paying attention. The classroom buzzed with a sense of energy that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Johnson's story had done something to the students. They weren't just sitting in their desks anymore. They were present, fully engaged, like they'd all been woken up by something real. Even Brandon, who used to be the one to crack jokes and roll his eyes, now sat with a quiet determination in his eyes. As the bell rang, Mrs. Johnson stood at the front of the room, watching the students pack up their things, some of them still processing what they'd just heard. But before anyone could make a move for the door, she spoke up, her tone light but firm. "One last thing before you all rush off to forget everything I just said," she called out, raising her voice slightly over the noise of zipping backpacks. The students paused, turning to face her. "I want you to leave here with something more than just a history lesson. I want you to think about how you treat people, how you see people. It's easy to make judgments, to assume you know everything about someone just because of how they look or where they're from. But the truth, you never really know. So take a moment, think before you speak, and more importantly, listen." She let that hang in the air for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. "And remember," she added with a grin, "no matter how wise and world-changing I may seem, you've still got that pop quiz on Friday. Don't think I'm letting you off the hook just because we had a heart-to-heart." The class groaned collectively, but it was lighthearted, the kind of groan that came with a shared smile. Even Brandon chuckled, shaking his head. "She really is something," he muttered to Zoe, who smirked back at him. As the students filed out of the room, there was a noticeable shift. They were lighter, more thoughtful, as if they were carrying a little piece of Mrs. Johnson's wisdom with them. And as Brandon left, he glanced back one last time, catching Mrs. Johnson's eye. She gave him a nod, one that said, "I see you." And for the first time, Brandon felt like he truly understood what that meant. That's it, everyone. What did you think of Mrs. Johnson's incredible journey and the impact she made on Brandon and the entire class? Which part of her story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comment section below, and let us know if there's another tale of transformation or redemption you'd like to explore next. If you found this story as inspiring as we did, make sure to hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. And hey, if you don't want to miss any updates or future stories, go ahead and tap that notification bell. Trust me, you won't regret it. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and remember, everyone has a story. Let's keep seeking them out and learning from each other. See you in the next one.